Good morning. Coming to you from the Paul family dining room here in Clintonville, Wisconsin to talk with you just a little bit about Babette's Feast. I've read all of your papers, enjoyed them. Some of you did your best work of the semester. I want to recommend, especially as you're going through the discussions and participating in the discussions, that you pay attention to the papers by Anderson, Bettine, Brubaker, Fitch, Muehlbach, and Smith. Sorry for just the last names, but that's how they're found in my grade book. So Steve, Felicia, Scott, Ryan, Carl, and Amy, good job on your papers, and I'm confident that if you spend some time reading them, you will learn from them, and your awareness of Babette's Feast, and especially the theological implications and practical implications of this film for liturgical practice in your working theology will be beneficial. And wow, that was a really long sentence. Anyway, the idea behind this film is the contrast between the austerity of, once again, the Scandinavian landscape and the extravagance of Babette's Feast. And what you have represented here then by the filmmaker, Gabriel Axel, is a contrast between austerity and abundance. And the implication being rather clearly that God's on the side of abundance, not in some kind of narrow or superficial prosperity theology fashion, but rather in the sense that grace is truly infinite and unconditional for us. Many of you made that point in your papers, which I appreciated very much. This is the third of four films set in Scandinavia that we are looking at, and that's not a coincidence. And of course, on the globalization of Christianity, as I'm sure you're aware, Christianity spread up into Northern Europe in the Middle Ages, and then of course through the Reformation. And it is especially in the Nordic countries of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway and Finland that many Lutherans settled. And we are at a Lutheran seminary after all, so some encounter with this particular strain of Lutheran theological reflection, it seems to me, is important and salutary. Not only because of the sort of parochial conceptions that might be articulated in Lutheran theologies coming out of Scandinavia, but also because it points us to some practical implications from Eucharistic theology that I think are really worth considering for us. If you're not familiar with what is called the Nordic Model of economic life, I encourage you to simply look it up. That is, just look up the Nordic Model, and it'll give you a conception of how Lutheran theological practice has played itself out in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, namely a robust and considerable tax system, but then a really, really strong safety net. And it was Luther's notion, in especially his early treatises, that the church had failed to care for people in a pastoral fashion, and that in fact the government, in his time, of course, the princes, had a responsibility to promote peace insofar as possible. Now, unfortunately, many of the princes took that too far and interpreted it also in a way that led them to hack and slaughter and slay peasants. But over time, the Lutheran economic model, the Nordic model in particular, both saw equality in society as an admirable goal, while recognizing that a living wage was an absolutely crucial thing for every citizen, and therefore providing free education, free health care for all, and a very strong safety net in case anyone fell off or fell out of the capacity to create a livelihood for themselves. So check it out, the Nordic Model. And that is behind this film, interestingly. That you have this conception of God's abundant grace that can be symbolized or represented in this one feast. That is, of course, an apocalyptic image which with deep, deep resonance in the history of Christianity that often gets overlooked in the pre-millennial dispensationalist model of the apocalypse, which focuses on the apocalypse as the end of the world. Now, as if you read the book of Revelation carefully, you understand that it is a critique of empire. It is a critique of the violence of the Antichrist manifest in imperial persecution of Christians and others, and the militarism and death dealing of the emperor. And in contrast, what we have in this film and in the vision of the apocalypse as a revelation in a wedding banquet, and the messianic banquet is a representation of abundance. And it's that contrast between the austerity of empire, even though you don't quite see how that's played out in this village, but villagers, perceive too what's going on macroeconomic levels and macro political levels and mirror it or create a mimetic reality that reflects what's going on in this sort of trickle-down pattern, which is how empires always operate. They promise this or that from top down, when in fact Jesus' way and the way of the cross suggests instead, from the bottom up, from empowering the people, which is what liturgy actually means, the work of the people. And so we have here a real meal representing or symbolizing the Eucharist, of course, but also a real meal. And that is, according to most historians, how the Eucharist began. That's why Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about the gluttony and the greed of people in the Eucharistic practice among the Corinthians as a scandal. That is, as an obstacle to the fulfillment of the Eucharist as this Thanksgiving meal to which all are invited and all are welcome and in which all have plenty. And it is that possibility that this film lifts up for us, not only in church practice, but also in public life. And so in my response to many of your papers, I pushed you to develop a working theology, or in a previous version of the LTSP curriculum, at least, we talked a lot about public theology. And that's what I was really pushing for here. So the Eucharist began as this real meal and became, as the empire took over Christianity, post-Constantine especially, but it was begun already before then as bishops began to usurp power and develop things again in that top-down fashion. The Eucharist went from a real robust meal to this trickle-down meal in which there was just a token of bread and perhaps a sip of wine, although by Luther's time, communion was usually just in one kind, just bread alone for the laity. So that change is a dramatic change and is reflected in the kind of austerity and ascetic monastic practices of the villagers. And I think the film points us to this contrast in some way. Every church is, in its contemporary liturgical practice, is more often than not like the villagers in this film. In other words, the Eucharist is a symbolic meal, even if we claim to have a theology of the real presence. It's a symbolic meal that waters down Christ, that turns Jesus into a token to be doled out by some imperially authorized representative, hierarchically determined by an institutional presence. And so what we have in this film is an alternative path in which Eucharistic practice represents a real meal again. And this is what many congregations have been doing directly or indirectly through dinner church and through various feeding ministries of one kind or another. That is saying that when people are hungry, feed them. That's what Jesus did and did so abundantly, as many of his parables reflect, and of course, as his quite real practice did as well. And that kind of meal then heals. I mean, heals our bodies. I don't know about you, but when I don't eat, I can tell. My body communicates that very clearly to me. And that healing that happens from a meal is what Christianity can incarnate for people in a quite real way. And unfortunately, again, much of our liturgical practice evades that responsibility because we mirror how empire works rather than actually being the church. I have a further reflections on this I'll share with you when the link goes live. In this coming month's Journal of Lutheran Ethics, I have an article exploring an economic reading of Luther on the Eucharist, and it really pushes toward what I call a sacramental economics. That is a public theology and a way of distributing the shared resources of the earth in a way that is responsible to the abundance that we've been given by God, and that practices stewardship for this. A couple of you in your papers pointed out the importance of the body-soul dualism as a problem, and that's one of the key elements that the film lifts up. The villagers are of the belief that they must sacrifice the body in order to attain salvation. That perverse theology is widespread in Christianity, including especially here in the United States among the conservative evangelical community and in the American civil religion. And it's a reflection, actually, of an early Christian heresy called Docetism. It's Docetism. And the Docetic heresy within Christianity points to a separation of body from soul and a denial of body in substitution for some transcendent element that is sought, and that then makes the sacrifice incumbent upon a believer, an obligation. So this is a form of works righteousness that also denies the real presence of God in Christ, in the flesh, and that then denies also the resurrection of the body. And so what we have in this film is a dramatic manifestation, a sort of compressed version in this glorious meal that is prepared of the presence of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ incarnate, in, with, and under the ordinary elements of bread and wine and quail. As a critique of the sort of docetic anti-body theology of the villagers that hurts them and actually divides the community and creates resentment rather than bringing together people in loving resurrected joy. So if there is a sacrifice in the film, I think it was maybe Scott Brubaker's paper who pointed out the sacrifice of the quail as a manifestation of Christ. And apologies if I don't have the citation quite right here, but this alien presence, that is God as bird, God as a quail, right, is a scandal to our normal sensibilities, right? We don't, think about God in these terms, do we? And yet, of course, this presence of God as bird runs like a red thread throughout scriptures once you begin to pay attention to it. Every thing from, the eagle's wings, which actually the Hebrew is nesher, which means vulture. So, that's one to wrap your brain around, God as vulture. And I could talk a lot about that, but I won't for right now. And, the presence of the Holy Spirit traditionally as dove as well. But lots of other manifestations like this, of this sort of righteousness from the outside, to speak in Lutheran terms, of this alien righteousness, God's surprising grace to us in the unexpected gift of the body of the quail for our sustenance, right? And that may be a sacrifice, and it's certainly laid out in ways that evoke that sensibility And most, Scandinavian Lutherans tend to be fairly high church. That is, towards the Episcopalian Roman Catholic side of Eucharistic theology. And so there would be this element of sacrifice there. But it's the sacrifice, the surprising sacrifice of Christ, not some obligation that is demanded by the empire of Christians in fealty to one supposed transcendent authority or another. The problem is, sacrifice often leads to self-righteousness. And so throughout the film, the sacrifice of the villagers, more often than not, is a problem. It's represented as something tragic, even, and especially in their emphasis on sacrificing the pleasures of this life for heaven in the next life. And that notion has been exploited by demagogues repeatedly as well. So the film points us through the villagers, the problem of unnecessary suffering in this life, and asks us the question, what might we do as people, including as people of faith, to address this unnecessary suffering? And here we have the example of Jesus. We have the example of Babette. What would Babette do? We might ask ourselves. She's coming out of this trauma from the French Civil War, losing her husband, losing her son, and is an act of recovery. And the culmination of her recovery shares this lavish grace, this incredible Thanksgiving meal with these unlovable villagers, right? Who have hurt themselves unnecessarily through their theology. And like Jesus, this meal, this extravagant grace, heals, leads to forgiveness and reconciliation. And so my last question then about the film, and last comment on the film before I let you go, is the relationship then between the Eucharist and politics in particular. There's a wonderful book by William Kavanaugh, a Roman Catholic theologian, entitled about Eucharist and torture. This came out shortly after it became apparent that the U.S. was torturing people in prisons all over the world, including down at Guantanamo. And he asked, what's the Christian responsibility when your government is involved in this kind of brutal behavior? And how does the Eucharist point us toward instead a different way? That is, one that doesn't demand sacrifice or inflict sacrifice on people, but instead invites people into loving community, what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community. What does that look like in our practice as leaders of congregations, as leaders of social ministry organizations? And it's that question ultimately that Babette's Feast leaves me with, at least, and I encourage you to ponder as well. In other words, what kind of vision follows from the revelation of God's grace in this messianic banquet to which all are invited and which changes everybody? I hope you're having a good week. I'll look forward to next week's assignments and to the ongoing conversations. Continue to do your best work, read the secondary sources, break down the films using the terminology that you've gained from Monaco, and continue to respond to at least 2-3 of your peers. And once again, papers by Steve, Felicia, Scott, Ryan, Carl, and Amy are particularly worthy of your spending some extensive time with them as well. So, peace to you from Wisconsin. I'll be in San Diego next week, lecturing at San Diego State. Looking forward to a little warmer weather than we've had here. It's been a relatively rough February. March hasn't been too bad. Lots of sunshine, which is nice, although today's kind of gray. But I wish you all the best. Peace to you. I've enjoyed the learning that you've been doing. This was a good week, and look forward to next week as well. Peace.